Hello and welcome to another episode of HYPIA Interviews with Hyperpolyglots. I'm the president, Dr. Usman Chohan, and today I have the pleasure of Enora, and I don't know how to spell your last name, Lessinger or Lessinger, so please correct me already.
Either, it's actually Lessinger originally, so up to you.
Lessinger. Welcome, Enora Lessinger, to this interview with Hyperpolyglots.
Thank you.
So there's good news in your life. You are going to be a lecturer at Oxford Brookes. So tell us about that to start off.
Well, it's actually really recent. As of yesterday, I was recruited by the University of Oxford Brookes for a position as a lecturer in applied languages. It's going to be my first permanent position in academia, so I'm really, really excited. And I was really pleased to see how welcoming the team was and how they made me feel at ease during the interview and afterwards. It's also great for me to move to England, which for personal reasons I've been wanting to do for a while. So all around good news.
That's fantastic. Now, the journey to become an academic and to become a lecturer is a long one, an arduous one. Let's talk a little bit about that because I know quite a bit about that journey myself.
Well, let's say it's been a difficult couple of years. I'd say that everything up to my PhD went fairly well. I went to the École Normale Supérieure, which opens you a lot of doors and things do flow quite well after that. So at first it was fairly easy. But then I found myself a young doctor on the market, and that wasn't fun at all. I basically, on top of having a full-time temp job, I was having to apply to positions all the time, which is another full-time job. So I've not slept a lot. But this is over now.
Oh, I think this is excellent news. Now, it'll throw the audience away a little bit, throw them off a little bit, because you are actually French. And we were just conversing in French before this interview, but your accent is so impeccably British that you would never have known. Right?
Well, they might have guessed. British people usually guess, yeah.
So the academia journey is a tough one. I sympathize entirely. There's a funny joke I saw, there's a lot of Facebook memes about being in a PhD. It's rough. And there was one about reviewer 2, because you publish, and then there's always the evil reviewer 2. One tends to be more generous, but reviewer 2 is the cruel one. So there's this image of a reviewer 2, and there's Satan next to him. And Satan says, I'm a really big fan of your work.
I love it. It's true. It's always the second reviewer who just kills your dreams. I don't know why.
So what is this lectureship post going to entail? What is it going to be like?
Well, that's the good news about it, is that it gives me a chance to continue in multilingualism, which was really something important for me. In my PhD, I worked with 6 different languages, and this was what made it so exciting for me. And so I was a little bit wary of the idea of getting into a job and only teaching one language, working with one language, potentially having to give up on research. But the good thing about this job is that it's both teaching and research, and I felt a lot of support to continue to investigate multilingualism. So that's what I'm going to continue to do. And for the teaching, there's a possibility to teach not just French, but also potentially English as a foreign language, and also Spanish, hopefully. It's also a part-time job. It's a 0.6 FTE. So I'm hoping to have a chance to maybe teach other languages on the side. I would really love to teach Hebrew and to do some translation as well. Mm-hmm. And to keep researching, of course. I'm exploring a new language. Well, I'm working with a new language in my research, which is Norwegian. So that's also taking me a lot of time because I have to bring my Norwegian the right level, which is obviously what I really want to do. The research is a bit of an excuse originally, but now they're working well together.
Well, that's fantastic. It sounds very exciting. So research at the doctoral level in multilingualism is something that I'm not exposed to, but I'm curious about. So tell us about your dissertation. What was the elements? How do you investigate? What did you find?
Right. So I did a PhD on the work of Kazuo Ishiguro, who's a British writer, writes in English. I don't speak Japanese. He doesn't speak it that well either, so it's really not. It's not about Japanese at all. People always think it will be because of the name.
Right, and I had read his book Never Let Me Go about 4 years ago. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. No, I love this book. I mean, I love all those books, but I didn't actually work on this one. I was working on 4 other novels. And I was looking at, it was called The Translation of Silence. What it means basically is I was working on to see how the implicit translated into other languages. Because in his books, what happens is that the narrator most of the time doesn't actually give you the information that you would expect to receive from a narrator. So there will be hints at things that you can sense are important, but it will never be clearly stated. And sometimes the hints are so subtle that they can be lost on the reader altogether. Every time I read his books again, I find new things, new threads, new subplots I hadn't seen before, and it's all hidden in just a turn of phrase or rhythm. It's really subtle, and I wanted to see how translators dealt with that, especially with the fact that when you're translating, you have this additional constraint, which is that if anything is unclear or doesn't appeal to the reader, people are tempted to say it's probably a poor translation. So you don't really have the same license as a writer. So I wanted to say how that impacted the work of translators and whether the hints carried through in the translation. And I looked at the translation of 4 of his novels into 5 languages. So that was French, Spanish, Turkish, Portuguese, and Hebrew. And obviously Hebrew is also a completely different alphabet where you don't have written vowels, which adds a new layer of ambiguity sometimes. So it was really interesting to compare these languages that were from 3 different families. And what I did find was that actually, yes, the hints do disappear quite a lot of the time, whether because of this additional pressure or simply because maybe the translators didn't pick up on it, which I wouldn't blame them for, because it took me 4 years of intense reading and rereading to find out probably not even everything there is to find out. So yes, a lot of the time the implicit didn't really carry through in translation. That was my main conclusion.
Right, and so what's suggested from your work is what people tend to begrudge, especially hipsters tend to begrudge, is that it's always better in the original. Isn't that correct?
Yes. And I have to confess, I don't really read books in translation. So I'm playing into this negativity. But what can you do?
Well, it works both ways. So English or Anglophone authors will regret when their works are translated and it doesn't do justice. But foreign authors complain about this a lot. When they do get a grasp of English later on, they say, well, I really did mean to say more than that. Really messed this up. What is the degree of creative license that a translator gets to have?
Well, I think it really depends on, well, a lot of the time on the editor, a lot of the people who are not the translator. So like in research, in my field of research, we tend to think of the translating entity so as to encompass not just the actual translator with his or her computer or notes, but all the people involved in the process of translating. And that can actually involve the author sometimes, but the editor is a big part of that, and the publishing committee. So it's very possible that some translators actually fought really hard to keep all of the subtle, the unclear, the ambiguities, and didn't win out, and were told that this is not going to sell. It's just not straightforward enough. So generally speaking, not very much creative license, I'm afraid.
Right. So we've had 2 other members of HYPIA on this series, and both of them, I got the impression that they had imagined doing more work that involves creative license, but for remunerative purposes, they end up doing a lot more technical manuals and medical journal stuff. And what happens is that there is no creative license in that. You can't really take that sort of license with work that has very precise definitions and you're really going one from one to the other. There is one aspect in it that they learn a lot. So perhaps one of them was not into engineering and became an engineer de facto. One of them had a medical background, so actually doing the medical translations made her connect with her family in that sense. But in the technical sphere, so this is practitioner rather than the novels, for example, it doesn't seem to involve that much license, right?
No, that's very true. I also am having to work for pragmatic translation, if you like. And it's true that it can be a bit frustrating. Although there is a thing called transcreating, which is the more marketing side of things, where you have to come up with, for instance, 3 different translations for like an advertisement logo or motto, this kind of thing. It can actually be quite creative. But it's a well-known thing that literary translators in particular do not very well living off their passion, and I think it really is a shame. But there are so many people on the market wanting to do this potentially for free, just out of passion, that it's just the way it ends up being, unfortunately.
So one of the big things about HYPIA is to, as this series in particular, is to expose the sorts of interesting things that hyperpolyglots do as part of real life. So they're more multidimensional than people would think. This is in part an effort to disprove the sort of media blitz that has happened, particularly on YouTube, where people do a lot of showmanship. So they're like, watch me do 6 languages now, pa pa pa, right? It's very artificial in the long sense, because if you were actually to test the subject, they wouldn't be able to do the sort of things you do. So how did your language journey come about? If you were doing, like, reading these novels, that's very high level stuff, how did you arrive at that capacity?
Do you know what? Actually, my original impetus for starting to learn multiple languages was very, very random and not very ground-based. My best friend was half Moroccan, and her mother was French and wanted to learn Arabic to speak the language of her husband, to learn the language of her husband. And to see this French woman speak Arabic on the street with other people whose mother tongue was Arabic was so impressive for me and so extraordinary that I decided to take up Arabic randomly at the age of 16. And so I did get into Arabic. I gave up Lectureship because I didn't have a teacher, and it's actually really difficult to learn on your own when you didn't have the techniques and the methods, and even with them, actually. So I've taken it up again recently, but it remains a challenge. But I think that was really when I'd always been good at languages and enjoyed them, but I didn't really see myself necessarily as someone who would work with languages or whose passion was languages until I started Arabic and fell in love with it, basically. And from Arabic, I went into Hebrew sort of by coincidence, because I was teaching French at Cambridge University and I wanted to start a new language. I thought Arabic's too hard. I'm going to do something similar, another language. And I wanted to take a Sanskrit. I don't know why. I think it's just as hard as Arabic. I can't remember. Or Hebrew. I couldn't decide. I tried Sanskrit. I couldn't find a classroom. So I went to Hebrew instead. And 5 years later, Hebrew is one of my favorite languages. It's the one I speak best after English, and it's become a huge part of my life. So there's a lot of randomness in my path with languages. But I think what's happened is that, unlike a lot of people who learn languages because they experience the need for it, they move somewhere and they want to know the language, or they meet somebody and they need to speak with their family or something. For me, it's more that every opportunity to learn a new language I seized, and then I made that language part of my life as much as I could. So making it part of my research is an example, going on long stays in the country whenever I could is another. So I feel like I very actively brought them into my life more than the other way around.
I understand, and I think that's fascinating. You'd be surprised how many other hyperpolyglots have a similar experience. It's an organic transmission as part of their life experiences. Well, sorry, I should qualify that by saying that the members of HYPIA the hyperpolyglots, this subgroup of the larger hyperpolyglot community tends to have it through an organic thing, as opposed to the YouTube showmanship where they're just reading book and they're like, oh, I've got it, here I go, here's the book, language number 20. That's different. But here it's been more organic, and that's why they're more low-key about it. They're not interested in displaying it. So there is one interesting thing, you may not notice it, but in HYPIA, there is a gender ratio issue in the sense that it's 70-30 male-female. Ideally, you would want it to be 50-50, but even 30% some people say is not bad. And the reason they think that is because of things like Michael Erhard's Babel No More, which pointed out that there is an overrepresentation of men. It's just a thing where guys do it. So the fact that, for example, you are part of HYPIA helps to disprove that myth. Now, I'm not actively seeking out people just because they're women. That's not the target. And we choose people on merit. But I think it's important to dispel the sorts of myths that people might associate with the hyperpolyglottism, that it isn't a guy thing per se, or it isn't a white thing per se. That's also a bit of a myth. Right, so there's a lot of popularization of people from like New Yorkers and Londoners who do this. You see that a lot of people in HYPIA are from Latin America, Europe, fine, but not necessarily. Asia as well. So I mean, there's really not. We want to smash these idols. So
yes, diversity is so important. Do you know, I'm actually surprised about what you said about the 70% ratio. I hadn't paid attention to this. And gender is a subject I work on. It's actually one of my main fields of research.
Okay.
So I'm annoyed with myself for not noticing. But the reason I'm surprised also is because at university, wherever I've taught, I've always had mostly female students. And I think there is this cliche also of humanities in general being more of a feminine field. So I wonder if there's something similar to what we call the glass ceiling, which you're familiar with, where you do get women learning languages, but maybe they won't have the opportunity, or they won't give themselves the opportunity to allow themselves to pursue this fully, or maybe simply that they would not feel confident to call themselves hyperpolyglot, or maybe something like that.
Yes,
it's a shame.
I think you're very right. I think there is something to the glass ceiling. I think there's also something to shyness. So a guy who is applying to HYPIA will be like, well, it's 4.5, but it'll give me 6. Don't worry about it. Guys are more ambitious like that. And women are like, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess, but I'm too shy on. And so it's even hard to get female. Two of our members have regretted coming on for interviews simply because they didn't feel comfortable with that sort of exposition, which we respect, obviously. But it's unfortunate because if we want to demolish the myths and they're not allies in their own cause, well, that makes it hard for HYPIA to do. I also perceive this sort of what I call the cook-chef difference. So domesticity in many cultures is associated with femininity, but the chefs that you see Michelin star tend to be overwhelmingly men. And I think that, yes, women are perceived to be more inclined towards the humanities in many cultures. But when it comes to the hyper element of it, 6, 7, then you will see the guys showing themselves up and working on it. So that's the chef. So the Michelin star chef equivalent is hyperpolyglot. So if you look at the distribution, I mean, speaking 3 languages is a big deal for many people. 4 is quite awesome. 5 means you made an extra effort. So then 6 is the threshold for HYPIA. How do you get to that point? It really must be a leap. So for you, it was a pursuit that was both professional as well as your passion, as well as your calling. Now, how many women pursue that? Oh, I don't know. What do you think?
But there's also the question of whether you have the opportunity to travel, if you have the financial means to travel, or whether your family will let you. We know that women tend to be protected by their parents a lot more than men for cultural reasons, perceived danger. And also, I think family life can be a big thing. So if I had children, for instance, I'm not sure I could keep going every summer I'm sure I couldn't actually going every summer to fully immersive summer language courses and this kind of thing. And I'm pretty sure I would have to stop where I am for a good 10 years. So that can be another obstacle.
I think that's very true. That's what it's part of the test of transitioning from the hunter-gatherer to the sedentary society. And sedentary society has put all these pressures on us. Capitalism has put even more pressures on us. if you want to pursue your passions. I mean, how are you struggling as a lecturer with that? I mean, it's your passion, but does capitalism remunerate it? It's a tough thing, don't you agree?
Not very much. Yes, I think you just have to be very clear about what you want to do. It's a question I asked myself actually, because I'm going to make a lot less in my new position than I would if I stayed on here and did a job that had no research and was just teaching one language. But I really took to myself and said, look, this is what you want to do. Money's not going to buy you this kind of thing. It's going to be so much more important.
I think that's a beautiful sentiment. Tragically, because you have another commitment, and because HYPIA is also stricting to more discipline about its interviews, we have to cut this interview short, but I think we both owe to each other a follow-up interview. What do you think?
Absolutely, that would be lovely.
It would be my pleasure. So on this happy note, I would like to thank you, Enora Lessinger, for the time that you have committed to this delightful interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.